we're absolutely honored and privileged today to have Rick Miller here from Olin College to deliver the first keynote, and it's my privilege to get to introduce Rick. Rick was appointed president and first employee, as I understand it, of the Franklin W. Olin College of Engineering in 1999. He also holds an appointment at Olin as professor of mechanical engineering. President Miller holds a BS degree in aerospace engineering from the University of California, Davis, an MS degree in mechanical engineering from MIT, and a PhD in applied mechanics from the California Institute of Technology. And prior to joining Olin, President Miller was Dean of the College of Engineering at the University of Iowa, a position that he held from 1992 to 1999. Before his time at Iowa, he had served on the faculties of the University of Southern California and the University of California, Santa Barbara. President Miller has research interests in applied mechanics. More specifically, he's investigated structural dynamics and nonlinear mechanics with applications to earthquake engineering and spacecraft structural design. And he's authored or co-authored numerous articles in technological publications, we're talking hundreds, and he's had a remarkable record also, though, of effective teaching. In fact, I was interested to note that President Miller holds 5 teaching awards that were issued by 2 separate universities, and so it's really quite a distinguished record. He's been asked to share his expertise with all sorts of organizations, including NASA, the World Bank, and the National Science Foundation. But if you'd allow me just 2 more personal notes about him. Over the last 2 years, with all the difficulties in the economy and the like, the Harvard Graduate School of Education has summoned people back to Cambridge to have discussions, and I've been privileged to be part of it. I'm flattered by it because the Harvard Graduate School of Education tells me that they only invite presidents who are willing to listen as well as to talk. So I find that a tribute of sorts. But the tribute extends, of course, to President Miller, because I've really gotten to know Rick in the conversations at Harvard and elsewhere. But what impressed me in the conversations at Harvard is he's a terrific listener. He's a terrific advocate of the kind of education that Olin College provides. But as impressive, if not more, he's a remarkably insightful person on the goals of higher education more generally. And for those reasons, I think we really benefit from having here. The second personal note I'll make is that I was struck that on one of the websites I looked at, Rick, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you actually met your wife in grade school. Is that true? Well, I was impressed by that because I happen to be married to my high school sweetheart, and I always thought that was impressive until I read that you've known your wife since grade school. In fact, I was particularly saddened by that in a way because I went to the same grade school as my wife, but I was scandalously 2 years her senior. And so as a result, in grade school, I never met her. She insists that she doesn't even remember me. And I find that particularly hurtful, given that I like to tell her that I undoubtedly saved her life many times as a crossing guard on her way to grade school. But in any case, enough reminiscing. It's my great honor to present President Miller.
Well, thank you. It's a real privilege to be here. This is actually the second time that I've been in this building. Union has been so anxious and so committed to education that merges and integrates engineering and the humanities that right after Olin was founded, I think the dean here was Bob Ballmer, and he had a meeting that was set up and invited me to come and speak then. So that was the first time that I'd got to meet folks at Union and to spend time in this building. And that was actually very early in Olin's tenure. I think it was 2000 or 2001, something like that. And I remember those days very well because, you see, Olin is a foundation that had a legacy in higher ed, giving away buildings, in fact, 78 buildings on 58 university campuses, in this long program of grant making. And they ended that program when they created Olin College. And Union College is one of the recipients of an Olin Hall. I'm sure you'll run into that if you haven't already. Which means when I show up on the scene and shake hands with the presidents of all these other colleges, you get this cold shoulder for about half an hour. Well, so this is the place that's responsible for the end of the grants program for buildings. It took a while to get over that. I didn't feel any of that when I arrived at Union this time. I think it's great. Also, it's very difficult to follow Steve. He's such an articulate speaker and obviously passionate about merging engineering and the arts. And so I obviously will not be as articulate as Steve. I will be even less articulate than I usually am, since my plane arrived last night about 1:30. And I'm still kind of in a bit of a fog, a little more so than usual. Let me begin by trying to make the case, or help make the case that you all make every day, about why liberal education is needed for engineering majors. And let me just start by talking about the legacy of engineering. And you can see, I'm sure most of the people in this audience are used to this website from the National Academy that recounts what they considered characteristics of the top 20 engineering achievements of the 20th century. These are really remarkable things. They're all about things like electrification, the invention of the automobile, the airplane, the radio, the television, the internet, the computer, space flight, and so forth. These are innovations in a very particular sense. These are innovations that changed life on the planet forever. There are very few people who can remember what life was like before the automobile or before the airplane. These are things that sort of transcend time zones and political boundaries and change life on the planet. Engineers are responsible for doing that. And I want to talk a little bit about that as we go through this. Now, if you look to the 21st century, the National Academy has made an attempt to try to identify challenges that we face on the planet in the 21st century. These are 14 characteristic things. I don't think the Academy believes that this is an exhaustive list or that they are perfectly articulated. They fall into sort of four broad categories: sustainability of life on the planet, health care and the continued frontier there, security in an age of terrorism, and contributing to the joy of living, including impersonalized education. These problems are different. These are not about things. These include human behavior. These include cooperation among nations and around the world and across disciplines as well. So one of the things that you discover if you look at the challenges of the 21st century is that we're dealing in some cases with unintended consequences of the challenges we faced in the 20th century. And I think if you hold up a mirror and you're honest about it, technology has played an interesting role in creating some of these things. Unintended role, but a role nevertheless. There is a sense in which what technology does is it provides an amplifier on human intentions. And this gets back to Steve's point earlier about values that underlie a lot of these things. Technology allows a smaller and smaller number of people in each generation to affect the lives of a larger and larger number of others around them. And it seems to be a one-way street here. It just is monotonously moving in that direction. Therefore, the responsibility that we face in technology for thinking about, anticipating, and working with others to counter these unintended consequences is never-ending and continuing to grow. So what is the role of engineers in all this? That's actually an interesting topic for a whole other meeting. Have to tell you, I was a little bit disappointed to see, once again, in the news in the past week when we were talking about the British Petroleum fiasco in the Gulf and this oil spewing out of a pipe, a mile deep in the water. The national media brings in experts to help explain to the public what's going on and what the solution is. Are they engineers? Not once did I see one. They're a physicist, they're a geologist, they're some other person. And the same thing used to happen when I was in LA and we'd have a major earthquake. Who did the media invite to explain how buildings are damaged and how we can? Seismologists, who actually don't know how buildings are built. Nevertheless, there is this public problem of understanding what engineers do. None of those technologies, none of those innovations would have happened without engineering. And what are engineers anyway? Well, they are systems architects of very complex approaches to problems. More and more, particularly in the 21st century, they will need to integrate technical, economic, political, social, and even religious consequences of what they do. Did you know that in the Middle East, where there is a major cultural gap between the way we look at things here, in many parts of the Middle East, America is known as the Great Satan. One of the contributing factors to that is that the internet may be the only way that they can actually personally experience the West, and America is seen as the largest contributor to pornography, which gets right into your home. Lots of these sort of unintended things. It was not the reason why the internet was created, but people use it in all sorts of ways, and you need to be able to think about it. Mechanized agriculture in the last century is one of the most important contributions that we made. There was a book called The Population Bomb. Paul Ehrlich. You remember that? Some of us are old enough to remember that. He was predicting that the world wouldn't survive to the year 2000 because there would be too many people and not enough food, and we would all starve to death. In fact, he was predicting what happened in the 1980s. It reminds you a little bit of the predictions we have now about global warming. His models all showed that you couldn't possibly get there. Well, what went wrong? Mechanized agriculture in India is what went wrong. They were able to feed the people and the growth in India much more efficiently than it was ever conceived when he wrote the book, and as a result of that, population just continued to grow. That's a good thing. We haven't all starved to death. On the other hand, on the unintended consequences side, I think America is the first country whose poverty class has the largest health issue with obesity. Not a problem getting calories. It's the only country that does that. Lots of unintended consequences. So what I'm aiming at here is to try to frame the issues that we face in the engineering education world, to think about what kind of engineering leaders we need in the 21st century. And at Olin, we've come to the conclusion that we primarily need engineering innovators, people who can change the game going forward. And let me talk a little bit about how education relates to this and some of the unintended consequences of our labels that we put on things in education. So if you start by thinking about all of our children, in America at least, in K-12 education, take pretty much the same spectrum of courses, same subjects together, from mathematics to art, everything in between. And then they graduate, and they go off to college. When they go off to college, they have to major in something. So if they come to Union College, they might major in engineering and science, or if they go to Cornell, they might major in business and economics. And they'll spend the next 4 years usually an identifiable region on the campus where most of the buildings are in a quad, usually, and the faculty there all sort of have the same textbooks on their shelves, and they speak the same language. In fact, they have the same lens on what they're thinking about in the world. And you might even say those people who study in engineering spend most of their time worrying about the feasibility of things. Is it possible to do this? What do the physical laws tell you? And let's look at the frontiers of moving those physical laws on feasibility. Folks, on the other hand, who are in a business school, spend their 4 years thinking about viability. And viability means, financially, does it create more revenue than it consumes? What kind of initial cost does it take? How long does it take for you to recover that cost? Is it legal? How do you get such a system set up? What about franchising? What about microfinance in the developing world? Those who don't major in engineering or science in this little simple model might go off and study in what we'd call a liberal arts curriculum, psychology, art, humanities. And for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to characterize that as worrying about things in life that are desirable, things that actually matter. This gets really close to values, things about love, about truth, about honesty, about motivations. Why do people do things? And that's where they spend their 4 years. Now, if you look at what you actually study, if you now get down to the accreditation business of counting credit hours, folks in the engineering world, if you have an ABET accredited curriculum, spend most of your time studying feasibility. And, for example, STEM subjects. And you'll recognize this if you're from engineering. 3/4 of those credit hours are filled up with things from science, technology, engineering, and math of some kind. And about 1/4 of it is left over for studying everything else. And all of the people you run into in engineering school have that same sort of lens, and they think this is okay. This is normal. This is the way I went to school, so why isn't it okay for everybody? If you go to a business school, it's a little different. The AACSB accreditation requirements for business require that half of all of your credit hours be invested in things that deal with viability, accounting, management, all of that. The other half can be spent studying other things. And so they accumulate a kind of outlook on life and a vocabulary for dealing with it. They put labels on things that come out of that green set of subjects. If you're studying desirability, they don't have the same kind of hard requirements that everybody must take X. And as a matter of fact, and this may be a little extreme, so I apologize for our non-science and engineering people in the audience, but there are negligible absolute requirements for feasibility and desirability. Now, let me explain a little. I have two daughters, neither of whom were interested in engineering or science, okay? But they both did well in high school, and one of them recently graduated from a fine college in the New England area. And I was personally disappointed to note that she went all 4 years without ever taking a science course or a math course. She apparently was exempted from this because she did well on the AP course credits when she was in high school. So that was enough, okay? And also, if you have a science or math requirement in most liberal arts colleges, there are often two tracks. There's one for the majors in the field, then there's one for the non-majors in the field. So it's like astronomy for dummies or something. You don't have to have calculus to have this kind of astronomy, and the number of majors that are in it is not the same. On the other hand, there isn't English literature for dummies. The engineering and science people have to go to that same section, and they're expected to. And I think that's one of the strengths of our engineering program. Nevertheless, through the lens of education, we have put labels on things, and we've formed cultural barriers to communication across these disciplines. Now, what does all this have to do with innovation? Well, if you really study innovation, as folks do in business schools, you'll discover that innovation only happens at the intersection of all three of these things. None of those changes, the automobile, the airplane, the internet, space travel, none of those things would have happened without all three requirements happening simultaneously. It's only at the intersection that you can make this work. Now, I've been personally socialized not to think about this. Okay, this didn't come out of my engineering course background. When I was a young assistant professor, I was taught to go to NSF and ask for money and explain the world to them this way. Innovation is what we're all looking for. That's absolutely right. But all innovation is a result of investment of money in frontier science and engineering research. Okay? See, this is the way it works. You put dollars in to fundamental research. That's me here at the university. And I will invent stuff in new ideas, and I'll publish these. And somehow these published articles will be picked up by some people somewhere, and magic will happen, and a new product will be developed. And from that new product, you'll generate new revenue. That'll give you more dollars so you can put more in. See, that's really how all important innovation happens. And that's equivalent to thinking of this pathway to innovation going from the upper left towards the center, sort of ignoring all the rest. And of course what happens is you get a lot of just-in-case science. A lot of science out there that's completely unfeasible or undesirable. People would never want to do this, but it's a cool problem, so we'll solve it anyway. That's fine, unless your intention is to innovate. On the other hand, I've spent enough time now, I'm on the board of trustees of Babson College, which is next door. It's a business school. You know, they use the word innovation too. They use it a lot. And it doesn't have anything to do with feasibility. Usually it has to do with things that have to do with financial plans and models. Their pathway to innovation is from the upper right. Okay? It just goes directly from a business plan to desirability. So it isn't unusual to get a phone call from a student at Babson who's working on a project that says, over the weekend, we figured out how to change the world. See, we have this whole business plan all set up. All we need is cold fusion. Do you think you guys could do that by Monday? You know, just send it over. That's a problem. I have a brother who's an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, and I've talked to him about this, and he says, in his view, the most successful plan to real innovative models that work is the one we haven't talked about. It's going up from the bottom. If you find an approach which people just sort of viscerally care about, you have much more freedom to develop the technology and to develop the business plan to make it work. Think of Facebook, for instance. There's some kind of fundamental force of nature going on there. I don't know exactly what it is, but that's a desirable thing to an awful lot of people. And that force provides the opportunity to innovate in ways that we won't find in our physics books. Okay, so with that chapter behind us, and you think a little bit about creativity. The rate at which new things are being developed and invented today is unprecedented. The technologies that will be needed to make a difference 15, 20 years from now haven't been conceived yet. There is a really interesting speaker, I don't know if you've heard of him, Sir Ken Robinson. Has anybody heard of Ken Robinson? Yeah, some people. If you haven't, if you don't do anything else, write this down, Sir Ken Robinson, and go on YouTube and listen to his 2006 TED Talk. It takes 19 minutes. It may change the way you think about education, okay? And his point basically is creativity may be more important than knowledge in the 21st century, because your ability to adapt and to respond to unexpected new challenges and invent ways of thinking your way through them may be more important than all of your memory about what worked in the 18th century. It just may not be as relevant. I've been doing some reading recently, trying to do what we tell our students they should all do. I mean, how many people in here have told your students that lifelong learning is a really important thing? Everybody should be doing this, right? And we're in academia, so we should be like at the leading edge of this. And so for years I thought that meant, well, I read the technical journal in applied mechanics and make sure that I, get my reviews in on time. I don't think that's what I mean by this when I'm telling our own students. I mean, read a book every semester for the rest of your life in something other than what you were prepared to do. And not just reading fiction. You should read a nonfiction book in something new. Maybe you'll learn something. I tried that. Maybe, it actually works. You do learn new things. There's a whole lot of new knowledge going on in cognitive science these days, particularly around what happens in education. And I'm sure this audience knows about that. One that really changed the way I think about things is Howard Gardner's book, the one in the upper right. And I'll come back to this later. If you think a little bit about multiple intelligences, which is Howard Gardner's contribution in 1983, where he was basically investigating the limitations of the IQ tests. Because in those days, people sort of thought you were born with a certain native ability in life, and it was as if it was tattooed on your forehead. If you could just read it, you'd find out what this number is, and it would determine everything else that would happen. And there was a fair amount of belief in this. And everybody wanted to know what the IQ was of your spouse or your child or yourself. And then, of course, Gardner came out with this result which basically says it does one thing really well. IQ results correlate quite well with your grades in school. But that's where it ends. When you graduate, the grades that you had in school don't correlate very well with your success in life in lots of other dimensions. And as he explored this, and he explored damage to individuals in car accidents and the way this maps onto brain function, he discovered people have multiple intelligences. Everybody has multiple intelligences. And we've sort of categorized these into three major areas. There's at least 7. In later work, I think he added another 1 or 2. And other people have taken lenses on this work. But it's robust enough, it's hard to ignore. The academic intelligence areas, which have to do with linguistic reasoning, mathematical, logical reasoning, are sort of what we do in higher education, in the mainstream of higher education. But the spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, and musical intelligences, for example, are completely independent. They're orthogonal to these others and have a lot more to do with experiential learning and experiential thinking. In every way that you experience the world, your mind can calculate and think and recognize and anticipate. Even though you can't recall this to your conscious mind, you still know this. The context is wrong. Somebody's telling you, I'm honest, I'll do this well. And there's something inside you that's saying they're not honest and they're not going to do this well. And it's these other intelligences that are playing in, particularly interpersonal and interpersonal intelligence. I don't know if any of you have seen this book. This is a really interesting novel, so this sort of breaks my mold. This is called The Curious Case of the Dog in the Nighttime. This is, anybody heard of it? A few. This is a book about autism. It's about a young child that was raised in England who is autistic. And you see through his eyes what the world looks like. This is a powerful book, let me warn you. I read it in one flight. That was a long flight. It was from Korea to New York. But I had tears streaming down my cheeks before I put it down, in part because I have, my brother has a daughter who is a special needs child, and I know what this is like when you go through this from a family situation. What it is it's an illustration of what happens in Gardner's framework when a child is genetically deficient in the area of interpersonal and intrapersonal ability. They are unable, for example, autistic children are unable to read emotion on people's faces. They can't, if you draw the little smiley face, or if you draw a frowning face and you ask them to explain what they see, they don't understand what you're saying. The only way they can relate to the world is through linear, sequential logic based on words and based on factual information. And that's how they have to make sense out of the world. To tell you, I felt a little bit creepy when I found out that there's some increased proportion of mathematically gifted individuals have a leaning tendency towards autism. And there's a spectrum here. This is not a digital world, okay? So beware. All right. So with all this background, let me tell you a little bit about Olin College, and as an exemplar of what we did when we were faced with the challenge in 1999 of reinventing engineering education from the beginning, thinking about what it is that engineers do and need to do in the 21st century, and try to create an educational model that will best prepare them for that role and best prepare all of us, because we're going to depend on these people to solve these grand challenges that we face. So that's an interesting problem in itself, and to rethink the process of education in general. So I got this letter in 1998 from the Olin Foundation that said somebody had nominated me for this position, and almost threw it away at the time. Things were going really well in Iowa, and this sounded like an interesting idea, but a little bit crazy. Then, of course, they said, well, we're not going to have tenure, we're not going to have departments, all sorts of things. And my wife said, we have 2 kids that have to go through college. Have you thought about that? She thinks of this as my midlife crisis, primarily. In September of 2000, I'm now at Olin College, and I have a team of people around me. And the real secret to success of Olin is very simple. It's actually doing what most people talk about in their speeches in institutions, where they say, what you should always do is only hire people who are better than you are. That works, okay? That's all we did. And me being the first person, you know what that means. It really does help. But the first question we run into is, what exactly is an engineer? And by the way, this set of questions actually arose around a conference table at Olin College in 2000. We assembled a group of faculty. We told them it's an interdisciplinary group because it takes more than engineering to teach an engineer. And we told them you have this really cool opportunity for 2 years to rethink education, and particularly rethink engineering education from the beginning, and to develop an approach that will do the best job of preparing the leaders. One hand goes up almost immediately. Excuse me, can you tell me what an engineer is? I'm actually a chemist. And, I've worked with engineers, but I don't really know what it is they do. And, by the way, don't we need to know what every engineer needs to know before we can develop a curriculum? Long conversation. In all the years that I'd spent in engineering education, no one had ever asked that question in a serious way in a faculty meeting in engineering. It was implicit. Whatever you need to know to be an engineer is what I know, because I am one. Okay? And I'll approach that in a minute. So we actually thought about this. What is an engineer, anyway? I think, personally, what we teach in engineering is applied science. That's pretty much what we do. It wasn't always that way, by the way, but in 2000, that's what we're doing. If you look at what the dictionary says, it's a person who carries through an enterprise by skillful or artful contrivance. Where's the word applied science or technology? You get this image of creativity, of passion, of an ability to manage and to carry through with a project to get things done. They are designers and architects of a system, process, or device. That's sort of out of the ABET approach. Creative problem solvers are what admissions officers always say to incoming students. Project team leaders, what you hear from industry when they're talking about an engineer that they want is very successful. And the definition that I like the most is from Diana Chapman Walsh, who was the president of Wellesley College for many years. She was our second commencement speaker, and in her commencement speech, she essentially defined an engineer as someone who has a compulsion to make. To engineer is to make. And she described this as a fundamental need of mankind. It comes from the same root as an artist has. And I'm now reflecting on my engineering education, I don't know any of my heroes who were teachers as an undergraduate or a graduate student who I would characterize as somebody consumed with the passion of to make. That's not to study and to publish, but to make, I don't know. So are we teaching what engineering really is? You've seen this. This is the STEM subjects approach that ABET requires. If you go to the next page, so what's in this STEM stuff anyway? Most of what's in the STEM stuff is applied science. And there's a small fraction of it, in some cases maybe only 1 out of 16 courses or 1 out of 10 courses, that's really fundamentally about design over 4 years. That's sort of an assessment, broadly speaking, painting with a broad brush around engineering education today. Has anybody thought about whether this is accurately reflects what engineers need in their profession? That's an interesting question, which doesn't come up very often in most circles. Turns out, yes. Some fellows at MIT have been worried about this, and there's a thesis on this. Another one of those things, if you have a moment, you might want to YouTube Professor Woody Flowers on education reform. He gave about a 40-minute talk on our campus a year ago, something like that, which was fascinating in this regard, much better than what I'm doing now. But with this permission, I got a little excerpt from this, which I'll share with you. What's this thesis say? Well, this student, Kristen Wolf at MIT, wrote a thesis on understanding the careers of the alumni of the MIT Mechanical Engineering Department. So what she did was a survey of graduates over 5 years. About 700 students went out. They got about a 46% response rate. Now, you can't read this eye test. I realize that, but I'm going to magnify it in a second. And basically, there's a bunch of lists of subjects and things that people need to know. And then this is what they learned as an MIT undergraduate. Okay? And then this is what they learned in graduate school. And this is what they learned on the job. That's what they learned somewhere else. And that's what they didn't learn at all. Okay? So this sort of source of where they learn things. Now, what is this? All those things over there on the left are the ME core, the core subjects that the Mechanical Engineering Department at MIT teaches. The underlying sciences, underlying mathematics, and then the topics that people in this room probably will recognize. Mechanics of solids, something very dear to my heart. Mechanical behavior of materials, system dynamics and control, dynamics. Those are applied sciences. Then there's the stuff in the middle that you might call professional skills, engineering reasoning, problem solving, experimentation, and knowledge discovery, system thinking, which you'd think would be fundamental for an engineer, personal skills and attributes, and so forth. And there's the stuff on the right, which you might call how and why, the testing, designing, developing of an idea, market conditions. Here goes this viability thing. If you put this all back together, you can see the ME core was basically learned at MIT. Okay, the applied science stuff. The professional skills was, and everything else basically was learned on the job. So they tell you this is what we use pervasively, and that's what we learned at MIT. Okay. Furthermore, how often do you use this stuff? Well, we never use that stuff in our job. Now remember, these are MIT students. If this is happening at MIT, believe me, it's happening everywhere else. The best of their students are going on to graduate school even. And now, on the other hand, this is what we use all the time. Now, how important is it? How much are you expected to be really proficient in this material in your current career? None. And I'm not only expected to be proficient, but I'm expected to lead or to innovate in this area. This is how I get promoted in my current job. So the summary is, this is what was not learned at MIT, but their alumni told them were absolutely pervasive in their job. This is what I would call the value of liberal education. If you're going to continue to hold the fence around the applied science core and say, what are you going to do with that other material, this is what you should do with that other material. On the other hand, this is what we learned but seldom used at MIT. There is a long list of applied sciences, and that's the STEM content in our engineering program. So this ought to give us a little pause as we think about redesigning an engineering curriculum. This is not the only place where this has been done, by the way. If you look at this National Academy of Engineering report, Educating the Engineer of 2020, how many people have heard of that? Probably most people here. What did they conclude? The same thing. Okay? Teamwork, communication, creativity, leadership, entrepreneurial thinking, ethical reasoning, global contextual analysis. These things, by the way, I would characterize, and a lot of people in engineering and science characterize as soft skills, right? Because they don't have a calculus prerequisite. So, obviously we're watering down the curriculum, right? If we're putting this stuff in. Maybe not. I would say this is more on the order of attitudes, behaviors, and motivations, not just knowledge. And if you think about the direction that education is heading, most knowledge today is a commodity. All of those courses that you saw on the MIT list, dynamics, strength of materials, thermodynamics, they're all available today on the web through the through the MIT Open Courseware project. You can download the whole curriculum if you'd like. That's a commodity. The knowledge you can get. The attitudes, behaviors, and motivations are what determine career success.